fewer and fewer every week, as planned. The Puritans got rid of all the chaff early. No, I'm just kidding. All right, so we are in our second week of 3 weeks on the history of Puritanism, and then after next week, so next week we're going to talk about American Puritans, and then after the restoration of the king, and then we're going to get into Puritan theology, Puritan life, and Puritan writings. So today we're going to cover, which is really the bulk of Puritan history, which is Jacobean or Jacobean, depending on how you want to pronounce it, and Caroline Puritanism. All right. So Jacobean Puritanism, it's named, right? So we say the reign of Elizabeth, that era, we call it the Elizabethan time period. The time for James, we call the Jacobean or Jacobean time period, because it's named after the king, who is James the Sixth and First. So he was the son of the deposed Queen of Scots, Mary. We've probably heard of her. Again, if you've seen an Elizabeth movie, you might have seen her. She was fiercely Catholic and a rival to Queen Elizabeth's throne. They were cousins. She's actually descended from King Henry the Seventh. Uh-oh. And she was executed by Queen Elizabeth in 1587 because she was actually involved. So she gave up her throne in Scotland. She had all kinds of crazy adultery things and stuff going on. And so she fled to England and asked for help, and they put her in basically house arrest. And after 20 years of house arrest, they executed her because she was involved some way in a plot to assassinate Elizabeth so that she could become Queen of England and bring England back into the Catholic fold. Her infant son, James, was crowned King James VI of Scotland upon his mother's abdication in 1567. He's born in 1566. He gets crowned as a baby, and he was raised a strict Protestant. John Knox preached at his coronation. He was tutored by one of the greatest minds in Europe, a guy named George Buchanan, and grew up to be highly intelligent, very theologically astute, and fiercely Protestant. Probably, no offense to the monarchy, but probably the smartest king of England, or most academic king of England they've had in the last 500 years. His presumptive heir, so his eldest son, was a guy named Henry Frederick, who was staunchly Calvinistic, but unfortunately he died at the age of 18 before he could become king. That's going to be really important in the story here in a minute. And he is rumored to have been a homosexual, which is very interesting. Historians really disagree on this point. One thing that is for certain, though, he did like to shower his male favorites with lots of money and other things and high offices, which not completely uncharacteristic of the age, but anyway.
Talk about James the First or Frederick? That last one.
No, this is James. This is James. Frederick 18 died. Yeah. So, in 1603, Queen Elizabeth dies after 45 years on the throne. Good Queen Bess. She dies. And so they need someone to replace her. The only problem is she has no kids. She has no heirs. She never got married. Right? And all of her siblings have predeceased her, and none of them had kids. Queen Mary didn't have kids. King Edward VI did not have kids. And so who does the throne go to? Well, there are three people in the line of succession that have an equal claim. Really, the only one that's got a chance is James. And he's got the advantage of he's already been king of a country for over 30 years. Right? So his entire life has been nothing but being king. And for the Puritans, it's a great deal because he's king of a Presbyterian country, right? A staunchly Calvinistic country. The kind of church that Scotland has is what a lot of the Puritans want to bring to England. And so James becoming king to them seems like a huge windfall. And so in Scotland, he's James the Sixth, but in England, he's James the First. Like I said, the Puritan expectations were high. Finally, we're going to get not only a king that's from a Presbyterian country, but he takes his theology seriously, and he's been educated by the best guys around. Why wouldn't we want this guy to be king? So there's a lot of high hopes with the Puritans when James is on his way down from Edinburgh to claim his crown. I think one historian said that James I treated every day like it was Christmas Day thereafter, after he inherited the throne of England. England, far richer country than Scotland at the time. Scotland, very, very poor country. And so they present James, before he even gets to London, a thing called the Millenary Petition. And it's supposedly a petition signed by 1,000 ministers of the Church of England, asking for a reformation of the Church of England along kind of the Scottish Presbyterian lines. And so James receives the petition, and he says, okay, we'll call a meeting about this very soon. And they do. In January of 1604, they meet at Hampton Court, which was the palace really made famous by King Henry VIII, in which James made it absolutely clear that he had no intention of changing the structure of the Church of England. He liked it way better. Because in Scotland, the king is not the head of the church. He's a member of the church, just like anybody else. He has no real special power in the church. Whereas in England, he's the supreme governor of the church. His will goes, right? So they invite some pretty moderate Puritans to argue their points at the Hampton Court Conference against the bishops. And James keeps saying, no bishop, no king, no bishop, no king, right? For monarchy, bishops make total sense. They fit hand in glove together. So James, despite being an ardent Calvinist, did not want to bring the Church of Scotland with him to England. But he did agree to a new translation of the Bible. So there were kind of two Bibles going around at the time. There's the Geneva Bible, which the Puritans had put together in Geneva in late 1550s, early 1560s. And it was really a study Bible. It actually had notes on the bottom. And James didn't like some of the notes because it implied that you could resist God-ordained authorities. At the same time, the bishop's Bible, which a lot of the Church of England used, was a terrible translation. I mean, grossly inaccurate translation. And James knew his theology. He was classically trained. He could read a lot of the language too, and he didn't think it was very good. So he did throw the Puritans a bone, right? He wouldn't let them change the structure of the church. He wouldn't let them change the ceremonies. But what he would allow them was a new translation of the Bible, which eventually, 1611, we get the King James Bible. We talked about that a little bit last week. Lawrence Chatterton, one of the big Puritans, the guy that lived to be 103, he was on the translation committee for one of those books, or for several of the books of the Bible. So what did Puritanism look like under James when he gets to England? It was not a unified movement. We've talked about this several times, right? Puritans could be Anglicans, or members of the Church of England, Presbyterians, Independents, which are also known as Congregationalists. Think of Baptists, but they baptize babies, or even Baptists. Right? We're going to start to see Reformed Baptists really on the scene, starting in the 1630s and 1640s. You had another friendly archbishop. We talked about at the end of last week, kind of the church strikes back, and they have several archbishops that are not friends of the Puritans after Edmund Grindal, right? You get John Whitgift, he's not a friend. Richard Bancroft, he's not a friend. Well, then you get George Abbot. And George Abbot is archbishop for a long time, and he's pretty friendly with the Puritans. He's sympathetic to lots of their arguments. And he's also a fierce Calvinist, like almost all of the Puritans. But despite the king's staunch Calvinism and many of his bishops, several churchmen start to come into the church and start getting preferred and promoted that show Arminian theology. Right? We talk about Arminian theology a lot in the church history class. Arminian theology, as opposed to Calvinist theology, it rejects what we call the 5 points of Calvinism. Actually, they create it. The Calvinists create the 5 points to refute it. But everything from predestination and all that kind of other stuff, the Arminians reject. And King James was really opposed to Arminianism. However, these guys kept getting in because Arminians were staunch supporters of episcopacy, bishops. You cannot resist the bishop. So it's one of those deals where you have your theology conflicting with your ecclesiology. And a lot of the times, they said, you know what? The guys would keep their theology hidden a little bit, and the king would kind of look the other way because they're going to be a supporter of the episcopacy, which is going to be a huge deal here, as we're going to see in a minute. And we had some guiding lights of the Puritans during these times. So we have William Ames, 1576, 1633. Right? A Cambridge man, like almost all of them, got his doctorate from Franeker University in the Netherlands. The English Puritans and the Dutch Reformed were big supporters of each other. They shared mostly the same theology. So you see a lot of stuff going back and forth with the Puritans from England to the Netherlands and vice versa. A lot of the Puritans went to the Netherlands to study. The Pilgrim Fathers of America went to the Netherlands first, right? The church congregation from Scrooby, England, they went to Amsterdam first. He was a professional teacher, right? A military chaplain, a fellow at the university, a professor of theology at Franeker. He was converted under the preaching of William Perkins. Remember, we ended our lecture last week with William Perkins calling the man down from the gibbet, from the gallows, to preach Christ to him so that he might feel confident in his going to his execution. His skill as a systematic theologian in debate with the Arminians earned him the nickname the Augustine of Holland and the Hammer of the Arminians. I wish you could fit that on a license plate, because I would get that license plate. The Hammer of the Arminians. What an awesome, what is it? Gangster. That is a gangster nickname. That is gangster. So, again, if you remember from the church history class, a lot of you were there. In 1618, 1619, in the Netherlands, they hold a synod called the Synod of Dort. And at the Synod of Dort is where the Calvinists meet to confront the Arminian theology that's spreading throughout the Netherlands. England, so King James, sends Calvinist representatives to that meeting. William Ames is there already. He serves as a non-voting member of the Synod, and he's the theological advisor to the chairman of the Synod. So very important fellow. They tried so hard to get William Ames to come to America, but he died before he could. His family came later, 4 years after his death. His library formed the nucleus of Harvard Library. The original Harvard Library was his personal library. And his Marrow of Theology was the primary textbook at Harvard for decades. You can still buy the Marrow of Theology by Baker. It's not a very expensive book. Fantastic theology. He's most famous for the opening line of it, where he says, "Theology is the doctrine of living to God." Right, which very common view with the Puritans. Some of them tweak it a little bit. Jonathan Edwards is going to add in Christ at the end of that. But William Ames, very influential at this time from the Netherlands. And then you get a guy named Richard Sibbes. Look, almost the exact same lifespan. 1576 to 1633 for Ames, 77 to 35 for Richard Sibbes. He was a Cambridge man through and through, a teacher, a lecturer. Remember, we talked about lecturers. Lecturers are people paid by you, the people in the pew, to come teach us at a different time than the Sunday service. So he did that for many years. He was the master of a college at Cambridge. That means he was head of the college. And he was also a priest at Holy Trinity Church. He was nicknamed the Heavenly Doctor because of his preaching and manner of life. He's one of those few Puritans that kind of everybody liked him. Puritans and non-Puritans alike. A lot of the Puritans were really hated by their contemporaries. Sibbes was one of those that just managed to get along with everyone. People just recognized his walk of life. He directly influenced many other Puritan leaders. John Cotton, who's going to be huge in the American story. Hugh Peters, Thomas Goodwin, also a major Puritan, and John Preston. His most famous work, The Bruised Reed, which we're going to talk about in a few weeks, was a Puritan bestseller. It is a fantastic book. If you are a person that often feels like your sin is going to overcome you and you're going to lose or find out that you don't belong to Christ, you should read The Bruised Reed. It is a phenomenal book. Phenomenal book. Charles Spurgeon said, "Sibbes never wastes the student's time. He scatters pearls and diamonds with both hands." That's from Spurgeon. I don't know if you've ever read Spurgeon. Spurgeon is throwing diamonds and pearls with both hands. So if a guy like Spurgeon is saying this guy is like that, it might be worthy of your time and consideration. You can buy all 7 volumes of Richard Sibbes' work from Banner of Truth. You can buy it from Reformation Heritage. I think you can get it for about $70 or $80, all 7. There's some great stuff in here. Great stuff. Mostly sermons. Most of the Puritan works were sermons. Beeke and Peterson write of Sibbes that he was a pioneer in working out the devotional application of the doctrine of God's covenant of grace. You meet a lot of people that say, "Pastor, don't teach theology from the pulpit. That's not what it's for. Do it in a group setting like this. Do it in a Bible study, but keep it as simple as possible out there." And so what ends up happening? Every sermon's the same. Every sermon's the same. And don't get me wrong, right? It's great that a lot of sermons, all they ever have is believe in Christ Jesus. We should never get tired of talking about that. That should be in every sermon. But that's not the sum of every sermon. God gave us the Bible to teach us about him, to love him, to worship him, to glorify him, to walk after him. And the Puritans, and Sibbes is a perfect example, say, you know what? You can teach the Trinity from the pulpit. You just got to put in the work, Pastor, to read the Scripture and to distill it in a way that the common people can understand. Right? The big, to me, one of the big scandals of evangelicalism today is they don't believe that you're smart enough to understand what the Word of God says. It really upsets me a lot. It really upsets me a lot. If God didn't want you to know about the mystery of the Trinity, he wouldn't have put it in the Bible. If he didn't want you to know about the hypostatic union, he wouldn't put it in the Bible. Now, you don't have to learn all the fancy theological terms for all of it, right? And a good preacher knows that. They strip away the terms, right, and they get to the core of the doctrine. But the Puritans thought that a 12-year-old, son of a farmer who still couldn't read, that he could understand the Trinity if the preacher did his job. And Sibbes is a perfect example. He pioneered the devotional application of the doctrine of God's covenant of grace. Predestination. People say, whether it's true or not, why do you preach it? Why preach it? It's too hard to understand. God talks about it all the time. Sibbes, this is Sibbes talking about that in regards to the love of Christ. He says this, he says, the whole chain of God's love so holdeth that all the creatures in heaven and earth cannot break a link of it. Therefore, never doubt of continuance, for it holds firm on God's part, not thine. God embraceth us in the arms of his everlasting love, not that we embraced him first. When the child falleth not, it is not from the mother's holding it is from the mother's holding the child, and not from the child's holding the mother. So it is God's holding of us, knowing of us, embracing of us, and justifying of us, that maketh the state firm and not ours. For ours is but a reflection and result of his, which is unvariable. Why is something, this is actually in the context of talking about election and predestination. How can you actually preach that to people where it matters? Are you doubting that you can fall out of grace? You can't. Why? Because you can't hold yourself in grace. Right? So we're about to have our fourth child. Anyone that has a child can tell you, a brand new baby doesn't stay up against Sarah's chest because of itself. It's not holding itself there. Sarah's holding it there. And it screams and it cries and it whines and sometimes it doesn't want to be there. But at the end it's there because Sarah holds it. And God says he will never cast us out. John 6. Puritans love it. John Bunyan wrote a whole book on it. You should go out and buy it right now. Come and welcome. Come and welcome to Jesus Christ. An entire book, 200 pages on the verse. All that the Father give to me will come to me, and I will never cast them out. So don't believe it. If many of us are in the military, when you move from here and you go to a church, if that guy doesn't think you're smart enough to understand the Bible, go to a different church. Go to a different church because you can do it, and you can do it easily if it's what you want to do. Right? Unfortunately, a lot of people don't want to do that. They think theology divides, right? Have you ever heard that? Doctrine divides? That's a really common one. Doctrine divides, you're right. It divides light from darkness. It's exactly what it does. Read Richard Sibbes. Come and Welcome Jesus Christ, John Bunyan. Cost you $8 on christianbooks.com. All right, so that's Puritanism kind of in the reign of James. I got to be careful or I'm going to waste all my time. Not waste all my time. Expend all my time too soon. So he dies 1625, so he has a nice good reign, 22 years, and then his second son Charles becomes king. Remember, he had an elder son named Henry. Henry died when he was 18, before he could become king. And this is really important because Henry was a staunch Calvinist. Charles, the second son, was not. Right? He was deeply influenced by high church Anglicans, right? Those that had a real high view of the role of bishops in the church and their Arminian theology. In fact, he married a French Catholic princess, which was very, very, very unpopular. Not just with the Puritans, but married a French Catholic princess. She brought her priests and confessor with her to England. And he forbade the preaching of predestination in 1626. He said, you know what, you guys are getting a little too crazy. It's creating too much kerfuffle in the church, so you can't preach this doctrine from the Word of God. Forbade the preaching of predestination, 1626. He appointed the fiercely anti-Calvinist William Laud to be Bishop of London in 1628, which is one of the most important church positions in England. And then in 1633, he made him Archbishop of Canterbury, which is the most important position in England. We're going to talk about Laud on the next slide. I am not a fan. Laud persecuted his opponents through the Court of Star Chamber. So they had this really creative way of punishing you if they knew they couldn't get you in the normal law process. They had this thing called the Court of Star Chamber, and what it really was is it was basically like the king's cabinet, right? So imagine a court in which the members of the court were like the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, right, the cabinet, and some church officials, and they would sit there and they had the right to prosecute you without you even being present in the room. And they could give out all kinds of punishments that they couldn't under the civil law. So one of the guys they punished, the guy, I mentioned him because I'm doing my dissertation on him, Alexander Leighton. Alexander Leighton wrote a book in the late 1620s advocating for Presbyterianism over the Episcopal system. And he said we should tear down the Episcopal system. It was a little inflammatory, but I mean, he took his theology seriously. They arrested this guy. They threw him in a jail where actually the ceiling was caving in and there were rats there. They fined him 10,000 pounds. To put that in today's money, we're talking tens of millions of dollars. I mean, most people, a pastor back then might, if they had a really, really good church, and pastors were paid a lot more back then, a pastor might get 50 pounds a year. They fined him 10,000 pounds, sentenced him to life imprisonment. They ordered one of his ears be cut off, his nostrils slit, his face be branded with seditious libeler, all of which was carried out. And he spent the next 11 years in prison until they overthrew William Laud, and then in a great twist of irony or providence, whichever one you want to call it, Parliament made Alexander Leighton the jail keeper for William Laud, which was great. And in 1629, King Charles dissolved Parliament. One of the reasons because they kept agitating against all the Arminians in the church. And Charles is like, I don't even want to talk about this anymore. I'm the king. We do it my way. So he dissolves Parliament 1629. He doesn't call another Parliament for 11 years. That's called the personal rule. So he rules without a legislature for 11 years. And during this time, that's when people are getting persecuted for their faith. Again, Alexander Leighton, William Prynne, a whole bunch of other guys, Henry Bastwick. Is it Henry or John? It doesn't matter. And so going into the English Civil War, which we're going to talk about in a minute, there are two streams. There are two things that's alienating everyone in the country. One, Arminianism in the church, and two, illegal taxation, because under the governance of England, Parliament has to give money to the king. No taxes can be raised without Parliament's permission, and the king is doing that without a Parliament, right? So you have an economic reason for civil war, and you have a religious reason for civil war, and they're going to join forces. We'll talk about. But William Laud, Puritanism's arch enemy number one, Oxford man. That's how you know he's bad. So as you can see, he had a lot of positions in the church. What's really funny is King James, so he was a favorite of King Charles. King James actually didn't like him very much. King James was a lot more politically astute than his son. And so William Laud told King James one time, hey, we should basically institute the government of the Church of England in Scotland. Wouldn't that be a great idea? And King James's response was, he knows not the stomach of that people. Which William Laud did not know. He was a tiny man, very small man, but had a large view of himself, very strict disciplinarian, and if you even looked at him the wrong way, you were getting kicked out of the church or various other things. So one of the leaders of the Arminian party in the Church of England, very anti-Calvinist in his theology. He persecuted his enemies through various means. We talked about the Court of Star Chamber. There's actually another court called the Court of High Commission. That was where basically the bishops, same thing, but instead of the cabinet, it was like the leaders of the Church of England, the bishops. And him and some of his friends, they didn't really mind Roman Catholicism very much. Right? They disagreed with some points of it, but they thought that the Catholic Church was a true church, though not a perfect church. Which to the Puritans, yeah, I mean, it's no, make it stop. It's like when you throw trash at Captain Planet, he just kind of disintegrates. King James's jester. So if you know anything about jesters back then, jesters they weren't all in funny costumes juggling all the time. Jesters were allowed the privilege of free speech. They were really the only ones in the kingdom that could really say whatever they wanted. In fact, King Henry VIII's jester was so bold that he made jokes about Henry's dead wives and stuff like that. I mean, that's the level of free speech you were allotted. So I told you, laud is a very little man. Laud is also another word for what? Praise, right? King James's jester said, "Great praise be given to God and little laud to the devil," which is very clever pun. And he was executed by Parliament in 1645. Depending on who you are, depends on what you think of that. I think he had it coming. The current Church of England holds him as a martyr for the faith. So there is actually a martyr day for him and for King Charles. We obviously, as good descendants of the Puritans, don't celebrate that day. So then we get to the English Civil War. English Civil War, a lot of civil wars in history. It's my favorite. If you like the American Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, or Russian Civil, whatever Civil War you like, just know that the English Civil War is more interesting. Well, it's most interesting to me because no other Civil War that I can think of has religion as one of its core tenets. Okay, and the English Civil War really is only about two things, right? It's about tyranny religiously, and it's about tyranny economically, or politically, if you will. So to me, as a lover of theology who thinks that your view of God is the most important thing about you, any civil war in a country that's fighting over who God is or how God should be worshipped, I find very intriguing. So how do we get there? So the English Civil War we already talked about. Largely the result, illegal taxation, the rise of Arminianism in the church. Because again, remember, most of the people that weren't Puritans were still Calvinists. So the vast majority of the country, whether they would be considered Puritan or not, by our definition or theirs, were still Calvinists. George Abbott, the Archbishop, until 1633, all the way to William Laud, was a staunch Calvinist. Even the guys that hated the Puritans in the beginning, John Whitgift and the other guy, that I forgot his name, Richard Bancroft, they were also Calvinists. So Charles tried the idea that Laud suggested before. He said, let's bring the Book of Common Prayer to the Church of Scotland. There's a famous story. A Scottish woman actually threw her stool. So a lot of churches still didn't have pews. People would bring like a three-legged stool to church. She actually, when they tried to institute it, I think she threw her stool at the bishop. Jenny, and I can't remember her last name. She's famous in Scotland. So in 1639, Scotland went to war with its king over religion. They said, we will not change our church and sacrilege ourselves to worship in your ways, after England tried to impose the prayer book on them. Well, Charles has a problem now. It's really easy to reign for 11 years when everything's hunky-dory, but when there's a war, there's no way you can afford a war without Parliament. You got to call Parliament. You need the money. And so he calls what's called first the Short Parliament, and they say, hey, before we give you money, you need to listen to us on religion. And he said, boring. Dissolved it, called another Parliament. They were even more eager to talk about religion. And he realized he didn't have the money, he didn't have the forces, so he had to start listening to Parliament. They demanded that Charles amend the political and religious innovations that had happened in the church during his reign, some of which he agreed to only by force, some of which he didn't. He had to agree to the execution of basically his prime minister at the time and some other things. They also managed to get him... So back then, the king could dissolve Parliament, which means he's really annoyed with him and he just says, you're disbanded. And then whenever he wants, he can call another Parliament and there are new elections. No, they have a much more... Well, no, not really. The king and queen really, even though they have some powers, they never exercise them. So can they dissolve it? I don't think so, not anymore. So, and really it's going to start here. So what they have, they implement a rule that Parliament has to meet so often, and the present Parliament, the Long Parliament, cannot be dissolved without its permission. And the king is forced to agree to this, which means he can't get rid of all of his opponents. They get to sit as long as they want to. Charles entered the House of Commons. This is a big deal. The king is not allowed in the House of Commons. It's the House of the people. I don't think he's ever allowed in there. He can go to the House of Lords when they do their annual speech from the throne. Even today, Queen Elizabeth will go and she'll give her speech from the throne in the House of Lords. But definitely without being invited, the king can't go in the House of Commons. He marches personally into the House of Commons to arrest 5 of his leading opponents, Puritans. They weren't there. He's forced to leave. And he eventually, in August of 1642, declares war on his own parliament. So the English Civil War. In the beginning, Charles had several early victories, but he was unable to capitalize on them. The Solemn League and Covenant in 1643 was basically a treaty between the Presbyterians in Scotland and most of the Puritans in England that said, hey, Scotland, if you come and help us in the war, we will implement a new church in England, one that is much closer to the Scottish model. And the Scottish say, hey, that's a great deal. So England and Scotland are both at war with their kings, and they both join forces to fight him. Parliament eventually gains the upper hand. In the beginning, they had kind of the classic problem. They had a bunch of noblemen as generals, and the noblemen were terrible. Right? They were terrible. They were cowardly. They were just not cowardly. They were afraid to really beat the king. And so Parliament came out and they basically said that no noblemen could be generals in the army, with the exception of 2, Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell, just because they were actually. It's kind of when, if you know anything about the American Civil War, when President Lincoln makes Grant basically the head of all Union forces, right? There are a lot of generals that, they're smart and stuff, but they're not really getting the job done. And Grant's going to do whatever it takes to win. Fairfax and Cromwell are the same way. King Charles surrenders to the Scots in 1646. He said, you know what? If I got to surrender to one of my peoples, I think I'm going to get a better deal from the guys up north. He surrenders to them in 1646. Under the terms of the peace treaty, the Scottish give him back to the English. Charles managed to convince the Scottish in 1648 to invade England. And so he convinces one of his peoples to war on the other peoples. The New Model Army, which was the army under Fairfax and Cromwell, they eventually crushed the Scottish at the Battle of Preston in 1648. And in 1649, Parliament, what's known as the Rump, they try King Charles I for treason, and they execute him. All of this is happening under the context of religion. So Oliver Cromwell's men, the New Model Army, when Parliament creates the New Model Army, it's the best army on the face of the earth. It's the most disciplined army, right? Because one of the requirements that Cromwell would use is he didn't care what your birth was, whether you were born poor or rich. He wanted Christian men as officers in his army, and also men of talent. His army would pray before going into battle. They would sing the hymns as they did cavalry charges. This was an army that took God seriously, many of them being independents or Congregationalists. And originally, Oliver Cromwell actually he gave the best terms. There are several times in the English Civil War where Charles has an out, where people come to him and they say, all right, well, time out, let's do peace under these terms. Oliver Cromwell actually gives him the best terms he ever gets. They say, hey, you can be king of England again. We can have bishops in the church. You just can't punish people that don't want to go to a church with bishops. You get to be in control of the army after 10 years. I mean, it was a sweet deal. Do you know why King Charles didn't accept it? True story. This is what his aide wrote. He didn't accept it because he didn't trust Cromwell. And the reason he didn't trust Cromwell is that Cromwell didn't ask for anything for himself. Most people would say, all right, and make me Duke of Oxford, or, something crazy like this. Cromwell asked for nothing for himself, and Charles profoundly distrusted him as a result, which ended up costing King Charles his head, 1649. So who is this Oliver Cromwell? Oliver Cromwell, even today in England, is really loved and really hated. He's just one of those guys. I think a radio station in England, they did a contest, and he's the third ranked the third most important Englishman of all history. So he went to Cambridge. In the college that he went to, they have his portrait hanging up, and it has little curtains. And anytime a monarch, one of the royal family come, they close the curtains so as to not offend the royal family, since he chopped off Charles's head. He's the great-great-nephew of Henry VIII's chief religious advisor, Thomas Cromwell. He starts off as a member of Parliament. Guy really, for his first 40 years of life, does not really distinguish himself in any way. But when he does go to Parliament, he's a zealous opponent of the kings and the bishops. In fact, his first speech in the Long Parliament is on behalf of Alexander Leighton. He's a deeply religious man following his conversion in around 1636, which he's already 36 or 37 years old before he's converted. But he becomes a zealous convert. He had no known military training before the Civil War started in 1642, but proved himself to be one of the greatest generals of the entire century. He crushed the Royalist forces at Marston Moor in 1644, Naseby 1645. He slaughtered the Irish Catholic defenders of Drogheda in 1649, which the Irish are still not happy about. So he killed about 2,000 Irish men, women, and children. Right. So the rules of the day were, if you were going to besiege a city, most cities had walls around them. If you were going to besiege a city, you said, all right, I'm going to give you one chance. You come out of there and you surrender and we're good. Everything's fine. But under the rules of war back then, if you were in the city and you didn't surrender and they had to fight, then it was perfectly legitimate to slaughter everyone in the town because it was going to cost so many lives on the other side to take the city. And so Cromwell, he gives them the opportunity. They say no. He storms the city, and his troops kill everyone that's alive inside. Even in one of his writings back to Parliament, I think you can kind of tell that he's a little uneasy about how that went down. Irish still not. So the Irish so if you remember this, for people older than me in the room, in the 1980s and 70s, 80s, 90s, big problems in Ireland, especially Northern Ireland, between Protestants and Catholics. There was some meeting, I want to say it was in the 90s, where they were calling both sides together, and the Irish would not meet in the room because there was a portrait of Cromwell in the room. They still take it that serious. He crushed the royalist Scots, right? Remember, the Scottish betrayed the English, came in for Charles at the end of the Civil War, or it actually created the Second Civil War. He crushed them at Dunbar, 1650, Worcester, 1651. He won both of those battles on his birthday, a year apart. And then he died on his birthday, too. So I guess it was his lucky day, maybe. One historian says of Cromwell that he combined genuine humility and self-disdain with a holy ruthlessness that came from his conviction that God is indeed active in history and that he, Oliver, was his instrument. A fundamentally generous, decent person who believed that liberty of conscience, at least for Protestants, was the best way to advance God's truth. He cared little for wealth or the other outward signs of worldly success. We'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. But he really, at the end of the day, he's so unique for his time period because he really thought if you were a Trinitarian Protestant, he really didn't care what you believed. He didn't care if you wanted to be a Congregationalist, a Presbyterian, someone with bishops. I mean, he really was, for that day, an extremely tolerant person. He invited the Jews to come live in England again. If you remember, we talked in church history in the 13th century that the Jews are outlawed from England. And for 400 years, it was illegal to be a Jew in England. And Oliver Cromwell actually invites them back. So, very intriguing fellow. He was very decisive, but he would always pray for an extended length of time to try and discern God's will before he went forward. And during that whole time of the Civil War, we have what's called the Westminster Assembly of Divines. Now, some of you might be uncomfortable with that, divines. Divine was a word back then just for theologians. In fact, so if you have a Master of Divinity, there are always a few in the room here at Makakilo, but if you have a Master of Divinity, right, in Latin, that's Magister Divinitatis, right, Master of Divinity. So they weren't called theologians back then, they were called divines. And they held a meeting to reform the Church of England. They said, well, finally, we got the king's kind of out of the way. And when we bring the king back, however that happens, we want a new church. And so in July 1643, they call representatives from London, both of the universities, Cambridge and Oxford, and every county in England and Wales, to basically a synod, a church meeting to decide on the structure of the English church. Most of the members were Presbyterian, but there were independents and Episcopalians represented as well. Scotland even sent representatives. They were non-voting, but they included Samuel Rutherford, who we'll talk about in a minute. They produced the Westminster Confession of Faith in November 1646, which eventually becomes the doctrinal standard in Scotland. For our Presbyterian friends here in America, the Westminster Confession is at the bedrock of their church's confessional statements. It also became, so 1647. It actually is never officially ironically, it's actually never the confession of the English Church. And it actually forms the basis for the Savoy Declaration, which is the Congregationalist statement of faith, and for those of us Reformed Baptists that like it, the 1689 Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. Very many times when you're reading the Second London Baptist Confession, it's literally word for word from the Westminster Confession, except the baptizing babies part. That's clearly not there. And then we get to this stage called the interregnum. This means between reigns. And I'm already going to help you out, right? Between reigns. So Charles I is executed in 1649. There's not going to be a king again for 11 years until Cromwell dies, and they invite Charles' son, Charles II, to come back and claim the throne. So that 11-year span is called the interregnum, between reigns. So the execution of the king, as you might expect, plunged England into a decade of political chaos. The entire structure of the English church, of the English government, is based off having a king. So what happens when you kill the king and you don't create another one? When you abolish the position of king, which is exactly what they did. They declared England a republic. By 1653, Oliver Cromwell is ruling as what's called the Lord Protector. They actually offered him the crown. Things were so kind of chaotic, back and forth, all throughout just imagine if your entire political structure, your whole church structure, the whole way that you had done things for 700 years completely goes away one night. Just think of the chaos that would bring in your own life. Just think of just how crazy that would be. And so eventually, after a few years, they said, this is getting ridiculous, guys. Oliver, please, just accept the crown. Let's go back to the old system of government, House of Lords, House of Commons, king of the top, you be king, and everything will be right in the realm. And he thought about it. He thought about it for, I want to say, 2 or 3 months. Which no one back then turns down a crown. In fact, over 100 years later, King George III was astonished that George Washington refused any thought of being king. In fact, when George Washington resigned as general of the Continental Army, King George III replied, "If it is true, he is the greatest man in the world." That's something for your enemy to say. Oliver Cromwell, he thought about it, and then he refused. He said, "I would not build Jericho again." We cut off the king's head with the crown on it, which means we kill the institution with him. And no one today, just imagine people chirping in the ear. Think of all the good you can do, Oliver. Think of all that you can do for Jesus Christ, Oliver, to be king of England. To turn that down, it's pretty remarkable. Again, king didn't trust him because he didn't ask for anything. He favored Congregationalism, but I told you he was pretty tolerant. As long as you were a Trinitarian, he was fine. The positive social implications of his... So even though he wasn't king, Lord Protector, he basically ruled as a king. During his time of rule, the illegitimacy rate, for those of you that don't know, illegitimate is when you have children out of wedlock. The illegitimacy rate in England plunged to 0.5%. The historical average for back then was 4 to 5%. Five babies out of every 100 were born to a woman or to a couple that was unmarried. Okay, today it's between 30 and 40%. As of 2013 in America, it's 44. 44% of American single mothers have never been married. Never been married. 44% of single mothers. That's crazy to me. Absolutely crazy. During his reign, during the interregnum, and back then it was still 5%, it got down to 0.5%. which I think says, can we create a godly society? No. Can we create a better one? Yeah, I think we can. Cromwell's England had the lowest rate of illegitimacy in 500 years of records. They've never beat his record, so he's got that going for him. But he died in 1658. His son, they tried to make his son Lord Protector. He just didn't have it with him. Things were chaotic, so they eventually invited Charles' son, Charles II, to come out of exile and come back and reclaim the throne. Cromwell was buried, but when the king came back, they exhumed his body, and they chopped it up. They put Oliver Cromwell's head on, I think they put it on a spike on Westminster Palace, and it stayed there for like 20 years, and then in a rainstorm it blew down, and it got lost. They actually found it in the late 19th century, late 1800s. They found it in, the Victorians loved to collect crazy things. They would have these like little curiosity cupboards where it's like, oh, this is a tooth from, a dragon or something. And anyway, it ended up, they ended up finding it. They did forensic testing and concluded that it is, in fact, Oliver Cromwell's head, which is pretty crazy.
So they found it in a cupboard?
Well, what they think happened is a soldier found it on the ground after it had been washed away. He sold it to a priest who was like there were no professional historians back then. A lot of times, kind of, priests were, in their off time, they were historians. It was kind of their hobby. And so it actually got passed down in several generations of this priest's family until it became part of this Victorian collection, yeah. But they were able to, so it had a giant hole in it from a spike, so that was one indication that it was Cromwell. Cromwell was very famously, had warts all over his face. And so we knew the locations of those, and they were able to, on the skull, there were markings from those deep warts. And so that's how they were able to determine. Cromwell, also one of those guys, when they went to paint his portrait, he told the artist, I will not pay you unless you paint me warts and all. Right? So back then, how everyone's standing in front of their mirrors and they're getting their perfect selfies, and then even if you don't want to, your camera pops up and, would you like this in sepia or vintage? How about low daylight? How about moonrise? And you can do all these things, and we doctor our photos because we're afraid of realism. I don't know what it is. We just got to make reality look better than it really was. And back then, it's even easier because it's not even a picture. It's a portrait, and you're paying the guy. So it better make me look really good. I mean, King Henry VIII, he's got these kind of classic ones. He was like 350 pounds by the end. He had a 54-inch waist. But somehow it never comes out in the paintings. He just looks larger than life. Cromwell said, paint me warts and all. Paint me as I am. During that time, we have another long-lived Puritan, 80 years, a guy named Thomas Goodwin. You can buy all 12 volumes of his works from Reformation Heritage Books. 700 pages on Ephesians 1. On Ephesians chapter 1. Cambridge man and Oxford man, which is unusual for the time. As you can see, he did a lot of stuff. He was a fellow, he was a lecturer, he was a preacher, he ministered in the Netherlands, he went to the Westminster Assembly, he lectured at Oxford, he was president of a college at Oxford, and he preached in London. Other facts about him: he was converted at a funeral, October 2nd, 1620. So I've been to a lot of funerals. My family's not particularly, they're not Christian at all. And so I've been to a lot of funerals that are interesting, intriguing. But one thing I've noticed about almost all funerals is they always try and be very uplifting, right? Even if the person wasn't a Christian, it's, well, Bob had a great sense of humor, and, he really loved his family, and, blah, blah. You never hear hardly anyone get up at a funeral and say, this was a terrible person. That's generally not the purpose of funerals. But the Puritans, they're not the only ones back then. But to them, that's a great opportunity to preach the gospel. Just think. I mean, even if you hate church, most of the time you got to go to a funeral. It's like, even if you don't even like the person, it's like, well, he's my cousin. He was really annoying. But I'm his cousin, so I got to go to the funeral, right? I mean, that's kind of how it works. Societal pressure brings non-Christians into funerals. And so what did they do? They preached at funerals. They preached Christ crucified. And if the person wasn't a Christian, they warned you not to be him or her. And this guy is one of the most powerful Puritans around. He's converted at a funeral. Don't ever underestimate the normal means of grace. I think one of the problems that we run into is we're always looking for that crazy conversion. And we kind of question ourselves sometimes if we don't have it. You meet the drug addict and, they were on heroin and then someone gave them a Bible and then all of a sudden their heart's on fire for the Lord. And we love to share these stories. And what really shocks me is we love to share these stories as a way of saying, see, look how incredible God is. Didn't you see it? To me, I'm way more impressed, to be honest with you, that the fact that a kid that went to church and was bored for 18 years of their life, I'm impressed that God brings them to the cross of Jesus Christ. Right? We're always looking for the exceptional. Charles Spurgeon, he went into a random church one day. The pastor wasn't even there. It was a layman who preached. He was converted under that layman. Before that, the person that had thrown the seed of the gospel at him was not his father, who was a minister. It was actually the cook, a female cook, shared the gospel with him when he was a child, and that seed brought forth. John Owen, who we're going to talk about next week, the prince of the Puritans when it comes to theology. John Owen wanted to go see a famous preacher, and him and his friend got to the church, and the famous preacher wasn't there that week. And so his friend said, hey, let's go listen to this other famous preacher. And John Owen's like, well, no, we're here. And some regular dude stood up and preached the gospel, and it saved John Owen. The saints of God, for the most part, that I read in history, are saved by normal, ordinary means, the same way that you are saved. We should thank God for the extraordinary conversions that he gives, and God be praised for them. But the mistake we make is thinking that if you don't have that, you're not saved. If you can't remember the exact minute you were saved, you're not saved. And that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. Converted at a funeral. He was a leading independent. He gave the most addresses at the Westminster Assembly. He really didn't want a Presbyterian church. He wanted an independent church. He attended Oliver Cromwell on his deathbed in 1658, and he helped draft the independent Confession of Faith, the Savoy Declaration. And then finally we're going to end with a Scottish Puritan named Samuel Rutherford. Samuel Rutherford is quite an intriguing figure. 1600, so born the same year as Goodwin, dies much earlier. He's in Scotland, not England, so he's a University of Edinburgh man. He's a professor, he's a pastor. He actually gets exiled from his pastorate because basically Laud and his influence in Scotland, they pushed the Orthodox faithful preachers out of the pulpit. So he actually gets exiled. He became a professor at St. Mary's College and rector of the University of St. Andrews. So kind of the principal, if you will, the dean, if you will. Other facts. So he was a humble man, very humble man, but he was very brutal with opponents, right? Samuel Rutherford would not have liked us very much for being Baptists. He's kind of like Luther. Luther wouldn't like us much either, right? It doesn't mean we can't like Luther, but they would have had very serious problems with our ecclesiology and specific our view of baptism. He was one of the 6 Scottish commissioners to the Westminster Assembly. Spurgeon considered his letters to be the closest thing to inspiration on planet Earth. So when he got exiled from his pastorate, he wrote letters to people, a lot of them women. Lady Kenmore comes up a lot. I was telling you about that. He would write these letters, and people collected them, and I think it was after he died, they made it into a book, The Letters of Samuel Rutherford. You can buy an abridged version of about 60 of them for $8 from the Banner of Truth, the Puritan paperbacks, The Letters of Samuel Rutherford. Or you can buy all 365, also from the same publisher. You read one a day. Make it your devotional. These letters are fantastic. I mean, it's hard not to agree with Spurgeon. Because someone would write him and say, Samuel, my my Christian husband died, and what a great Christian husband he was. And then he would write back and say, I know it's terrible you lost your husband, but think how little you've lost in comparison to Christ. The man was on fire for Jesus Christ. He knew suffering. At the same time, he's writing all of this in the context of suffering. He's not telling other people, hey, you're gonna get through this, or hey, love God in your suffering. He's going through it too. He's exiled from his faith. All of his children died before him, and he was about to be arrested for treason at the time of his death, probably to be executed. I can't think if one of my children died. All of your children? John Owen's going to be the same way. John Owen loses all of his children before him. 11 children, all dead before him. Samuel Rutherford, same way. I think Samuel Rutherford actually loses a wife or two along the way as well. These men, when you read their writings, you say, man, I wish I could love God like them. And then when you read the history of them, you say, look how they love God in suffering. And we see so many people around us who, at the first sign of suffering, right, they cry, oh God, why me, why me, why me? The Puritans did too, but in a better way. Like, why me? Why are you showing me so much favor that I get to suffer for Jesus Christ? Most of us don't have that. I want to read you this quote from a fellow pastor. A fellow pastor at the time of Samuel Rutherford wrote this. He said, many times I thought he would have flown out of the pulpit when he came to speak of Jesus Christ. He was never in his right element, but when he was commending him, he would have fallen asleep in bed speaking of Christ. And you can go read his writings right now for $8. For $16, you can go get John Bunyan and Samuel Rutherford when you leave church. In fact, in the break between now and the other service, you can log on to Amazon and order them both for Prime, and you get free shipping.
The audiobook is really good.
Audiobook, it depends who's reading it.
I have it. It's really good.
Okay.
For the letters.
Okay, good. Again, if you remember nothing else from here, just remember the website to go buy the books. Go buy the books. Right? I'm not good at telling you about the Puritans. The Puritans are great at telling you about God. And that's what I really want from all of this. Yes?
Oh, I just want to say, if you order from Manner of Truth in Hawaii, like on their site, the shipping is pretty expensive. But if you just email them and say, hey, I'm in Hawaii, they will just charge you what the shipping costs, and it knocks it like way down. They're so sweet.
Yes, and you can do the same thing through Reformation Heritage books as well. So, and then some of them are just going to be cheaper on, Amazon has some of these things for like $8 and free shipping. You can't beat it. And again, some of the bigger sets, again, 7 volumes, Richard Sibbs. I think this one costs $80. 12 volumes of Goodwin costs, I think, a little over $100. If you have Logos, you can buy almost all of this stuff on Logos too. At the end of the day, I just want you to go read the Puritans, because at the end of the day, what I really care about is I want you to love God in Christ more than anything on earth. And I have never met men that bring me to see in the scripture God in Christ better. No better Bible commentators, no better theologians, no better ministers have I ever found that as a group show me how to read the Bible and to find Christ there. And these people can do it when their kids are dying, when their ears are being cut off, right? When they're being sentenced to jail and all kinds of other stuff. So for us weak 21st century Americans, 21st century Christians, we need what they're preaching. And again, at the end of the day, they felt that God has imbued you with a soul, with a mind that's capable of understanding everything that is meant to be understood in the Word of God.